the uh, master plan study that's going to happen in the next couple of months for the Armadale area. We specifically are dealing with an area from Cobb Point down to the Kansas Avenue as a kind of specific area, and it's envisioned as a kind of complementary to the master plan for the Armadale area itself. What's important to recognize is that our study has no any implementation intention behind it. It's really more to provide a vision study, present possibilities of ideas, particularly for the development of Kansas River as kind of constituting element of an improved urban environment in Kansas City, Kansas. Next semester, we will be looking more specifically in design development for some of the areas along the Kansas River. And the next semester is going to be dedicated strongly to the community engagement process. And we anticipate at least 3 public meetings and design charrettes that we will bring into the community, engaging with the community. So the ideas that we are presenting here today, I just want to make sure that there's no misunderstandings. These are not any implementation ideas. These are preliminary studies that will be further vetted and developed in collaboration with the community. So there is nothing in that is imminent. It's more really kind of an attempt to engage community and provide a vision that eventually everybody can have some kind of participation and provide their input, and that we can create something that's resonant with community and provides some kind of perspective for future development. So with that, I don't know if Kimberly or if Gunnar have joined us and would like to say something on behalf of the KCK government and the Planning and Urban Design Department before we move into presentation.
Yeah. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So Gunnar's not going to be on this call, but he will be on the one later today. So we're working with the Kansas City Design Center on what we are considering to be the Armadale Area Master Plan. So it's kind of a partnership where we are using the Design Center's research, mapping, and all of that work as an existing conditions analysis to be included in with our master plan. And so, like Vlad said, they are not doing implementation items, but we are taking those existing conditions to build upon them and create implementation strategies for the Armadale neighborhood overall.
Thank you, Kimberly. And also, I would like to, as Kimberly mentioned, there's going to be another session at 4 o'clock for those of you who may not be able to stay fully on this presentation. You'll have a chance to catch up the rest of it later on if you choose to do so. Our presentation is organized in 3 parts. We're going to be first presenting overarching ideas and conceptual framework for the master plan for our project as a first session, which is going to be 20 minutes, and then we're going to have 10 minutes time allotted for questions and answers. And then there are going to be 2 subsequent presentations for a specific design area that we are starting preliminary design investigations, and each of them will also be 20 minutes with a 10-minute Q&A opportunities. And I really want to encourage you to provide us with your feedback and input. The critical and fundamental aspect of these kind of studies and the project itself is really its community service purpose, and that cannot happen unless we have robust and open dialogue with the community. So your feedback, input, ideas, thoughts, and critique are extremely important to us, and we welcome them. Hopefully we're going to have a good exchange as we move through the presentation. So with that, I will turn it to Kent, who is going to start our presentation. Kent, are you ready to start?
Yep. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Kent Bentley, 5th-year architecture student here at KCDC, and I'll kind of walk us through kind of the order today. So for today, we'll start with a brief overview of our overall objectives for Studio and different site scales we studied. Then we'll go through the main conclusions and findings about our area. And lastly, the Studio will present our conceptual framework and master plan so far for our area of study. So our area of focus this year is on reimagining the River Valley and the Kansas City area, specifically the area surrounding the Kansas River and Armadale. Our Studio objectives for the project are to rethink the Kansas River as an integral part of the city identity to reconnect the city to the river as a repurposed and extended public realm. And lastly, to enhance that connection between the two cities of Kansas City, Kansas and Kansas City, Missouri, using the river as a catalyst. And kind of our process for this objective has been through our research and analysis, where we conducted an inventory of our site, focused on several conditions of the site, and began to form our conclusions about the area and some possible design solutions. From there, we needed to underline a conceptual framework for the project based on these findings, which resulted in a conceptual master planning framework and the integral parts that were in it. We started by defining the scales in which were the most important for us to work within and would give us various scopes of information. The first scale we look at is the riverfront scale map, and this allowed us to look at all the neighborhoods along the Kansas River, including Armourdale, and determine more about the overall area and how it is used. Then we moved into our bluff to bluff scale so that we can acknowledge the importance of the River Valley region and understand what topographical challenges we are dealing with. And lastly, we have our focus site, mainly looking at the central industrial district as well as the context across the river.
Hi guys, my name is Sloan Satterley and I am on my phone today, so I just want to check that you guys can hear me fine. Can you guys hear me?
Hey Sloan, your mic is really quiet. Can you move it a little closer to you if possible?
Yeah, is this better?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so start off, I'll take you through the findings framework. And the research methodology that we used to further analyze our findings was cause and effect, and then identifying what the opportunities are that come from that. And overall, when we're looking at the causes, the most consistent characteristic of the city space is its disconnection. So this map shows that overall disconnection that we're talking about, and then we break it down to what we perceive to cause that. First being the topography. And this LiDAR scan map really shows that valley that we're dealing with. And then further looking at the river, we noted it as being the first defining environmental feature of the site. And this historical map here shows just how the water in the valley has developed and changed over the years. And then the next major cause of the disconnection is the rails and infrastructure. And because of the topography of the area, as well as the river, the flat river valley allowed for implementation of heavy rails and infrastructure, which then over time developed up onto the bluffs as well. And then as a result of both the river and infrastructure, the area became industrial in nature. And these are all those parcels that are the industrial, so pretty much everything surrounding the river. And then now, after looking at these causes, we define the most prominent effects being elevational division, there being three identities, disconnected and lack of public realm, as well as ecological impact. And when looking at these three areas, there's no cohesive fabric to the cities due to history and geology, as well as the use. In breaking down the first effect, we noted as a site experience and elevational division. And because of changing topography throughout the area, the site is experienced in a different stratus. So we began to study these strata and found that there were four main layers, which are in the river, on the levee, on the ground, and then on the bluff. And we studied the qualities of these layers in plan figure ground and in site section, and then in relation to disconnected streets, significant spaces, and what you could not see for access from each point. So here we just did this process for each of the four vertical strata lines across the site. And then when analyzing dynamic view sheds as you move to the site, we found that objects were more vertical in nature, like billboards and buildings above 2 stories. And we also highlight here in each of them what was appearing in the view along the road most as you drive through. And this particular study here of Central Ave was just one example. We did this process for multiple major streets within the site. And ultimately, it showed us that a design must address the infrastructure on our site differently than on the ground level, since it's experienced on a different plane. The next effect was the city being divided into 3 parts. And here's the breakdown of those 3 areas. And then they all have their own sort of identity, which is more clearly broken out on the next slide. So Strawberry Hills, it's pedestrian scale residential with regular street grid. CID is spread out industrial buildings at a larger scale with tall infrastructure running over the area. And then Armourdale is a hybrid of the 2. And the organization of the street grid with zoning also affects the east and west connection, with those most walkable connections being in the north and south orientation there in Strawberry Hill and Armourdale. And the third effect we defined was the river disconnection and lack of public realm. So we identified that the public realm has little to no connection to the river, with only 2 public access points and much sparser open green space than the surrounding areas. And then the last major effects were the ecological impacts. So for one, we're dealing with heavy industrial use, which has created large areas of contaminated land called brownfields. And this here is just an overview of all the dominant contaminants, which are VOCs, heavy metals, PCBs, and oil. And then the lack of tree canopy due to industrial land use, in addition to the levee, has created these heat islands you see. And here we also identified where there's higher levels of noise pollution. And next, assumed smells analyzed establishments around the site and broke them into categories based off potential smells. So things like coffee, restaurants, water treatment, newly cut grass, manufacturer, supplier fumes, and then highly dusty smells. And due to the nature of the site in the heavy industrial area, it was important to analyze air pollution in KCK and CID. And according to the EPA, particle matter impacts the site primarily, which is most likely due to those industries around. And then due to the high traffic volumes, both on the streets and the highways, fumes from vehicles, trucks, trailers, those produce high amounts of diesel particle matter that also impact the surrounding neighborhoods. And overall, air pollution in KCK, Armourdale, and CID was noted by the EPA that the pollutants in these areas do in fact have an impact on the health and wellness of the public. And those closer to these industrial parks are more at risk for cancer. Also, the EPA listed the following impairments for our section of the river, those being high levels of E. coli, murky water, high levels of phosphorus, and degraded aquatic life. And these impacts are largely a result of upstream activities, including sewage overflows, sand and gravel mining, and then agricultural runoff. And lastly here, the sewer and stormwater map, just being another challenge and obstacle that we'll be working with. So now for the opportunities that we focused on from these findings are the river area potential, the node potential, the social potential, and the ecological potential. And this is our conceptual diagram encompassing what we see all of those opportunities being. So foremost, we saw that the river is an access between major areas of the site, but it is unused and inaccessible at most points right now. But there are points along the river that can be developed into something that connects the city to the river more. And next, this slide shows the visual figure ground of the site, and when you're standing on the levee, what you can see and then what is blocked. And the next one starts to talk about the physical space that is open and not impeded by anything, and you can actually walk on. And then, as we mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, our site does sit within a floodplain. So the levees that have been created to protect the surrounding communities also create challenges in accessing the water. And here we just went into a further analysis of the river so that we could see what the challenges are then to creating a more public realm here. And we did pair the hydrograph to compare and show just how quickly that water level can change depending on the day and the season. And then another finding supporting the potential in this area is that the flow of the water in the Kansas River is better suited for recreation compared to the Missouri River, where it's much faster. As well as the potential in these sites of higher ecological value, which you can see a pretty good size bit there at the base of Armourdale. Another opportunity we saw is that the site area can be grouped into nodes. So the first node that we classified we call Noodletown, and this area is defined by the immense amount of infrastructure that divides the space and the topographical shift onto that Strawberry Bluff Hill. As seen in this view shed, the main space defining feature is the I-70 viaduct. And the spatial organization study also starts to show how the streets and the off-ramps of the infrastructure start to create vertical barriers that divide the site. There are also these significant buildings and spaces in the I-70 viaduct and Strawberry Hill area that bring character to the site. These buildings are seen from dynamic moving views on the highway and can be used as wayfinding elements to bring people to this public realm. So for example, the grain silo seen up north by Cobb Point is a major one that shows a lot of the site's character. And then when you're looking south on I-70, you start to see the significant historic buildings up in Strawberry Hill that can also act as opportunities to draw people in and be used as a wayfinding point. The next node is located in the CID area. And this area is defined by the rail yards that surround it and act as barriers of entry. The river and the levee divide this node into two spaces on both sides of the river, and then the infrastructure that goes over the space starts to further divide it. When looking at these dynamic views for this area, there's not any major focal significant space that would draw people to this node when you're driving over it, but there is other opportunities in this node to develop some sort of draw that would give people a reason to go to this space. Another big aspect of this node is the Central Ave Bridge underpass. And this space is very popular for locals in the area and has a significant car community population. So we see this as being a big opportunity to use as a connector between the two sides of the river. And then this is just another view shed of that underpass. The third node is the most public oriented zone of our site, but it is still significantly disconnected from the river. And the node boundaries are still defined by rail yards and infrastructure, but the one major difference in spatial division is that there's not the significant infrastructural divide across this area like the others, which is why this area has been the easiest to start developing. And there are already major eye grabbers in this area as well, like Hy-Vee Arena and Rock Island Bridge. So using these as a way to draw people to that future riverfront public realm is a significant opportunity. Next, when looking at social potential, we first studied what the commuter travel looked like, and the map indicates both destination and the direction of travel. So the red circles that you see here illustrate boundary workers' residences, while the blue circles represent the boundary residences place of work. The red line graphic portrays the direction that boundary workers are coming from, and then the blue line graphic portrays the direction that the boundary residents are going to. So people coming to the site are mainly coming from the south and the west, while the same path is taken for people leaving the site. And then upon further analysis of the social and cultural life, we discovered that Strawberry Hill is a very active neighborhood with plenty of informal and formal public spaces. And then for CID, it might be heavy industrial, but the communities there really do make use of alleys, streets, parking lots, and under infrastructure. So unlike CID and Strawberry Hill, Armourdale lacks a stronger social and cultural life. And we then created a network of these established festival and event locations to see how they connect with each other. And they are mainly clustered along 7th Street, with most of these locations in the Strawberry Hill area. And then here is where we identified where those bus routes and area of travel are from each of these activity hubs. For health conditions, they are a concern in the community, with the most prevalent being obesity and mental health. And these conditions affect people across race and age, suggesting a large benefit from designs that promote physical fitness, nature, and social interaction. The crime has been a community concern, especially with gang violence in Armourdale neighborhood. And this map pinpoints KCK crime locations for the year, and the most prevalent acts, according to the KCK Police Department, are theft. The main ecological issues with the site are water pollution, heat exposure, brownfields, and soil contamination. And the ecological potential looks at opportunities to reduce the impacts of these effects through green infrastructure projects and reforestation. So here, because our site resides in this river valley region between the two bluffs, surface water from both of the bluffs is funneled down to the lowest areas on our site. And this allows some areas of the site to be more susceptible to flooding when there's a heavy rainfall. And then when identifying the vacant lots in the area, there is potential for water retention systems in some of those low-lying areas. And there are also some spots in Armourdale that have been deemed problematic for flooding and pose an opportunity for further investigation as well. And then lastly, this map highlights the lack of trees in the area and some potential locations of new trees. So the unused rail land and the levee trail are both prime locations for trees in the future. adding more tree cover to the area would help not only with noise pollution, but also the heat island effect. And then I'll pass it off. Okay.
Thanks, Sloan. So from these findings, we worked on setting up our vision and mission goals for the project. And this diagram helps us begin to articulate what we envision for the future of the project and what we hope to achieve. So for the vision statement, we seek to create an improved urban setting that reconnects the city to its geography and establishes the industrial Kansas River as the defining element that reorganizes and strengthens the identity of that city. Next, the mission of this project is to reevaluate the land use of the Kansas River Valley in order to reconnect people to the river, promote community engagement, and enhance the image of the city. We seek to reappropriate the balance between industrial areas and the public realm, enrich the ecological environment, and form a synergistic relationship between existing industry and the public spaces that fosters a pattern of shared use along the river. And lastly, our goals, being the most specific elements of this framework, have been broken down to 3 categories of public realm, industrial, and environmental. Our public realm goals are to improve and expand public spaces and pedestrian movement in the site and create new amenities that are safe, inviting, inclusive, and meaningful. Our industrial goals center around developing a synergistic relationship between industrial infrastructure and the public realm. And lastly, our environmental goals include implementing green infrastructure strategies, adding bioswales and water retention strategies to improve flooding issues, and adding foliage in areas to reduce the heavy heat island effects that we've seen. And next, from the finding frameworks and vision, we were able to move forward and start to highlight conceptual diagrams that focus on addressing the opportunities and issues we have found. The concept works in 3 parts or scales that each work to resolve certain issues and overlay to form a unified whole. First, the north-south overall connection deals with connecting the overall area of Kansas City, Kansas, north to south along 7th Street, and also creating that important connectivity between Armourdale and Caw Point along the Kansas River stretch. In the second step, we want to focus on the east-west connection over the Kansas River along these main routes of Kansas Ave, Central Ave, 7th Street, and James Street. And lastly, we want to focus on the nodes of opportunity that we have identified along the Kansas River where the team could start to form design strategies that connected the river as a whole. All in all, we hope that these concepts serve to turn the Kansas River into a major public realm access that connects our currently disconnected areas. So first we'll start with overall connectivity. We wanted to ask, how could we connect downtown KCK, Strawberry Hill to Armourdale and over to Caw Point? And most importantly, how could we connect the Kansas River stretch from 7th Street and Armourdale to Caw Point? We began by taking an analytical approach to the whole area of study to understand several environmental and physical conditions that had been found in previous research. First was flooding, vacancy, and rail. Next was smells, tree foliage, and noise pollution that we've seen. These maps overlaid on each other would give us background information to create a map showing parcels that were most suitable for green infrastructure. Then we compared dead-end streets, vacant lots, green space, and informal public gathering spaces to get a better grasp on what parcels of land would be best for public realm using the same process. We then compiled all these layers to understand what parcels in our scope would be most suitable for either green infrastructure or public realm. This process involved looking at each parcel in the study area and determining how many factors from the previous maps began to affect it. The more that affected the parcel, the more potential it had. The last step was to overlay both maps, green infrastructure and public realm, to determine what parcels were beginning to have high potential in both realms. This process was used moving forward as we started to look at these parcels in exact areas that we wanted to study, starting with 7th Street. The first phase of the concept is focused on connecting Strawberry Hill KCK to Armourdale along the already trafficked 7th Street. This phase of the concept is more in broad terms of where the studies show that interventions can happen along the street to make it more connected as a whole and increase travel between the 2 areas. The potential parcels were then narrowed down to what was pertaining to 7th Street along that stretch. This allowed us to see where stopping points or places with high potential of intervention began to form with these clusters of potential parcels. From here, we move into connections, focusing on how the concept can unify the currently disconnected 3 cities that we've seen and connect into the larger areas of KCK and KCMO as a whole. This is important since it is a vital factor in making our main idea of a city-centered river work. We want to create a connected loop in a way that brings people between the 3 areas and most importantly to the river. This process started by demarcating our boundaries for the loop and creating a hierarchy of streets we wanted to examine. First, for the east and west borders, 7th Street and James Street were chosen since they were closest to that connected all the way down through the city in each area. These serve as the major routes. Next, the two connectors of Central Ave and Kansas Ave are the only streets that cross the river in between the boundary. They are also heavily used on the Kansas side for retail and restaurant locations, which makes them prime to connect down to the river and the bottoms. Lastly, we identified the major streets that tied into the loops from the outside areas of KCK and KCMO. These identify where major points might land along our loop that would make sense to develop or study. Then we use the same process as before, utilizing our green infrastructure and public realm maps to get an idea of where clusters of parcels of areas of opportunity started to arise. This understanding of where many of these parcels lay and also where our previous study of 7th Street tied in led to a series of stopping points and developable corridors along this loop. First, the stopping points were formed where there were a cluster of potential parcels in our map and also a connection to important pieces of the area like Crossroads or the River Market. Next, a system of developable corridors was made by outlining those green infrastructure and public realm points, along with further research into what areas along the path were lowest density or where large parking lots occurred. This gave us a blueprint for most developable land. As a system, this piece of the concept serves to strategically find what areas of the site are best used for intervention and how they tie together into a cohesive whole with the river at the center focus. This research also allowed us to see that on the bluff edge of Strawberry Hill, a pedestrian loop could eventually be created that tied these corridors and stopping points together and also took advantage of the dead-end roads that stopped at the edge of the bluff. This piece could begin to tie into a river stretch area further on as well, creating pedestrian linkage from bluff to the river. So for the conclusions of kind of this first piece of the concept, it was the area needed connection due to its currently disconnected state. And this proposed connection seeks to tie the three areas together in a unified whole that brings public realm to the center of the river. And lastly, this piece of the concept also serves to outline areas for green infrastructure, public realm, and development opportunity in the future. From here, we move back into our first diagram to talk about the most important piece of the concept, which is the river area. This part of the overall connectivity uses the river as an axis to connect through the site from Armadale to Caw Point. Before beginning, we started by compiling some of the background research we had done for the river regarding water flow speeds, structures on the river, levee wall conditions, and sewage outfalls. We also studied water heights and where in the river was more shallow versus what was deeper. It was also important to note what was flood wall versus what was an earthen levee along this stretch. And where there was an earthen levee, we needed to know max and minimum heights as well as these fluctuations that we've seen. From here, we identified the most reasonable start and end points of the river stretch we wanted to study, which were located at Caw Point and at the end of the 7th Street in Armadale. Then came more study on what the environmental health, demographics, and development, along with traffic, were on both sides of our stretch. This showed us what spots had more green space, what areas were more dense in population, and what spots had more new development. We also wanted to understand what the space was like along the river visually and physically. Where did we have more room to work before buildings happened versus where it was mostly untouchable? As we began to narrow down more and more about our stretch along the river, we started to mark out where major viewsheds were happening, as these could serve to become spots where a river interaction point or development could occur. Next, we overlaid ecological factors to our stretch to understand that there are several points in the river with more priority for reforestation and tree coverage potential. This also takes into account heat island effects we had researched earlier. Another ecological issue along the river was the outfalls. These areas were marked to give us an idea of where we needed to take steps to circumvent those areas as we created our path along the river. And lastly, we overlaid our green infrastructure and public realm parcels to understand where these larger areas of potential parcels were lying, as well as which were mainly in the Caw Point area, Central Ave, at Rock Island Bridge, and down by 7th Street in Armadale. With all these previous factors in mind, a system of hard edge, soft edge, natural edge, and river interaction points began to develop. At a hard edge, we envisioned some type of built edge down to the river. At soft, it would be more of green infrastructure or natural trail. And at natural, it would be mostly untouched. And at river interaction points, we envision a major stopping point or development along the path. This was paired with existing walking and bike trails, along with new development at Rock Island Bridge and the stockyards. This led us into a system of where a new trail could begin to develop and where it tied into those existing trails and paths. And overlaid on top of each other, you begin to see how the system takes advantage of these issues and opportunities along the river stretch. And as we move into more development of this river stretch plan, we began to organize how the different points along the river were meeting and interacting with the water. This is based on a system of built edges and natural edges that each spawn from specific needs in that location. Where there is not room for a large trail on top of the levee due to rail or industry, an elevated trail could be used. This path could be at a height above the max flooding or reside closer to the water and become a temporary means of access depending on flood levels. In terms of a more natural edge, a green infrastructure edge is a means of getting down to the river in a more organic way and could combat flooding in that area as well. For areas that a large amount of people wanted to access the river, we used an accordion deck edge. This was derived from a precedent and is a river interaction that rises and falls depending on the water height. When the water is low, the deck could utilize these vertical areas in between each level for a variety of options that can be explored further on. Where there's a levee wall, a system of ramps that trace up and down the wall, allowing views and access across in a playful way, could make a previously heavy barrier could bridge a previously heavy barrier to interact with the public and also bridge the gap to the river's edge. And lastly, development could be imagined over this wall in a way that bridges the river access gap and also creates a unique riverside development area in that spot. In the final part of the river stretch study, we went more into detail to propose where public realm versus development made the most sense and how these interventions interacted with the pedestrian realm along the river. This resulted in a system of river interaction points, public realm, future development, and pedestrian linkage that serves to unify the river stretch as a whole and link these areas that differ in character and purpose. From here, the studio was able to divide these portions of the river into nodes that could be explored further into how each one worked on its scale and interacted with the overall concept area. Each of these areas has a specific goal that arises from its character as well as what purpose it can serve to unify the river as a whole. And kind of to conclude some of this river stretch concept stuff, we included one of the precedents we've been studying at Crescent Park and kind of noting its design strategies on how it was dealing with some of these levee walls and linkages across this river edge with industry. And if you go to the next slide, I think you can kind of see this green infrastructure park that is designed to be flooded since it's in front of the levee wall, but when it's not flooded, it provides this pedestrian public realm to the river's edge. And that kind of wraps up our river concept section. So to make our final conclusions, the river concept seeks to create a continuous public realm that connects Caw Point to the end of 7th Street in Armourdale. And this concept also serves to connect the surrounding city to the river and serve as a catalyst for future development. And lastly, the vision and concept as a whole serve to unify the Kansas River area, bring access and connection to the river from the 3 adjacent neighborhoods, and better connect to the larger areas of Kansas City, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri. So this will bring us to the end of our first section, if anybody has any questions or discussion. And you can go to the next slide, I think, Tyler.
And for those of you joining our Facebook live feed, you can post comments, or those of you on the Zoom meeting, you can also make use of the chat box. But we will open it up for a couple minutes for discussion.
And please note, if you want to speak, that you need to unmute yourself because everybody's on mute. So as I said, people would welcome comments and inputs at this point.
Hi, this is Andres Alfaro. Thanks for all your hard work. This is pretty cohesive interpretation of existing conditions. The only one comment I had that I was hoping you guys were going to get to was, did you guys look at how the site and area was utilized before the highway? Obviously, you pointed out in some of your analysis, the highway being a big factor in how you experience the site, but I'm more curious than anything onto how people use this area and circulated around it kind of early 1900s.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I would maybe turn that to some of our people in our history group that looked at some of that stuff, since I know they kind of researched some of the history of the interstates and roads in the area.
Yeah, one of the kind of more interesting things about the highway is before the highway, they had a much more elaborate streetcar system that ran both KCMO and KCK. And obviously there's still a streetcar in downtown KC, but it just kind of, once the highway's been built with the Highway Act of 1956, I believe it was, it just, you saw it slowly phase out, and crossing the river with the streetcar became less of a thing. So then the streetcar became only in KCMO, and then eventually just kind of dissipated completely, and as more people started owning cars and using these highways.
I guess with the resurgence, obviously, and recent news of the streetcar expanding, did you guys think about that, or look at potentials of bringing that back and how that would integrate with some of these great strategies you proposed?
Yes, it's definitely something we're looking into and continuing to look into next semester also, is how we can use some of these existing bridges or existing infrastructure and to possibly create a way of the streetcar to cross this river without having to build a giant structure or spend a ton of money. And maybe that means taking the streetcar literally over the river, or maybe it means something else to get people towards more towards a location to where they can access the streetcar and make it just more universally acceptable for not only downtown KC, but for Kansas City, Kansas as well.
Is there anyone else with questions?
Right, I think we have a question from Susan on the racial and social equity issues. I don't know.
Thank you. I just saw that.
I don't know, Michaela, would you like to address that?
Yeah, so Sloan and I were part of the demographics group towards the beginning of our semester. And definitely within the Kansas City, Kansas area, there are several factors, including race, that kind of start to divide people. For example, we know that there is a large Hispanic community, not only in Armourdale, but that also stretches into the Riverview area. And we know that Strawberry Hill has been historically a more European community. And so because of these things, there's also starting to be kind of a language gap. A lot of people are only speaking Spanish, or people are only speaking English. So a lot of times there's kind of miscommunication between the different races. And that's definitely something that we've looked into with other statistics and how, race might influence the life expectancy in the area. For example, one of the areas that we looked at was up just north of Strawberry Hill. This is a mostly Black community, and their life expectancy rate is much lower than the rest of the community. So these are definitely statistics that we've looked into. And I think that we are trying to address some of these within our specific designs. But it's definitely something that we would like to hear more about the community about, and really getting more of like personal experience input into it as well.
Do we have any other questions, any other discussion, or should we move to sharing with you the two design points? Of course, this is a chance for us also to answer any questions and engage in any specific issues that at this point you may see the problematic, or they're not quite clear as to what are we proposing, how we're thinking to approach some of those things. If not, if there are no further comments, then I would suggest that we move to presenting the two study areas that we are hoping are going to become the major focus for the next semester. And I think some of the issues, critical issues of equity, and social and economic and racial equity is something that we definitely are going to be focusing very much on the project. And as Michaela mentioned also, we've been starting the dialogue with some of the communities, particularly in Armadale, gathering information, trying to be more interactive. And that is a trajectory we would like to continue in the next phase of the project as well. So if any of you have any suggestions, any specific input to that effect, I would be much appreciated. It would be much appreciated if you can share that with us so we can follow, or if you'd like to engage with us on those issues too, we would be extremely appreciative of that as well. So Taylor, if there are any other comments, maybe you can take on and talk about.
Yeah, of course. So my name is Taylor Slusher, and I'll be taking you through the I-70 and Central Industrial District node. So this first diagram that will pop up shows the two northmost nodes in relation to the overall river stretch diagram. This directly helps us to derive many of our big ideas and intentions in these spaces as we begin to detail them within these orange or continue on. So it is more of an overarching concept, but the main focus is within kind of these orange dash boundaries where we begin to hone in on those key ideas. And so this second map is more of an overarching concept. The main focus being those yellow arrows and how the pedestrian flow in this region is intended. Secondary to that, how the traffic and movement flows in and out of this region. In our axon diagram of this concept, you can better understand these called out spaces and what exactly we're trying to connect and how that green highlighted neighborhood, Strawberry Hill, would directly benefit from all these nearby considerations. And so within these next process maps, this first one is talking about the disconnections, which starts with the river. And then the topography, which is the second major element of disconnect, which is then followed by the interstates and highways, and then followed by a significant railroad infrastructure, and which leaves our site as three discrete islands, which we will seek to connect. And then through development of underutilized land and pedestrian circulation network of new existing trails and bridges. And so, and then going into the I-70 node, to start, we broke down these areas into subregions, beginning at the northmost node, Cop Point I-70. And so this slide summarizes the issues that impact this region, which include the disconnections, street traffic patterns, and deficiencies of urban typology. A key strategy to this concept is how to connect to Cop Point. There are existing trails, but railroads and topography make it complicated to access. And so bridging over the rails will allow access to the infraspace under I-70, and extending the trail along the river's edge with a vertical circulation element will not only improve access to the existing heritage trail on the other side of I-70. And so this particular section shows the extension of the trail under the interstate, followed by another section that shows the proposed elevator and stair tower to the heritage trail. And so to the I-70, and so this talks about kind of the Crescent Park, which is in New Orleans, Louisiana. It is very similar in character what we want to be driving or wanting to achieve. So the ability to bridge over and traverse down is a significant grade change, which is similar in character to the challenges we face. And here's another image of that. And so diving into the I-70 kind of redevelopment plan, the I-70 stretch begins at that KCK entry point off of I-70. And so the vision for this plan is to create a gateway. There's one large parking structure, open parking lot, and an empty lot that could help define the edge. The proposed development welcomes traffic off I-70 and even those driving by on James Street. This promotes a strong urban edge and completes the city's boundary. In section, the building masses connect via a circulation structure, emulating the idea of a gateway presence, welcoming in those coming into Strawberry Hill. Lastly, the development height within the bottom section showcases the feasibility of the building height to regain a strong city skyline. And then moving down to the I-70 infrastructure space, this area focuses on the integrated river heritage trail and analyzing nearby green spaces, attempting to bridge the gap of nearby disconnections. This first major disconnection is the street grid running through the underside of the I-70 underpass. And so the current layout of vehicular circulation prohibits the ability of the underpass space to connect with nearby spaces. However, by proposing to remove the James Street, the space opens up towards Cobb Point and most importantly, the river. And so this map shows the finalized traffic pattern. So vehicular traffic will be forced into Strawberry Hill, which in turn will benefit the exposure of the new urban edge development. And so the major spaces within these boundaries considers the redevelopment outlook location of St. John's Park, the immediate space under Old I-70 that begins the bike trail, and the in-between space of Noodletown. And so taking a step back, the highlighted massing showcased here is the restricted space in relationship to the river and Cobb Point to the east. However, the space greatly increases in massing once part of James Street is removed, allowing the connection of Cobb Point, the river, and surrounding spaces to be made. Okay, so the underpass character adds the complexity of space with running infrastructure above ground. And so the topography of the infrastructure creates a series of spaces within the underside of the structure while promoting unique void spaces in between of these structures. And so this is a section that kind of talks about those in-between spaces and the spaces under the highway. And so from there, the above ground topography is created. The character is very complex from a dramatic slope and topography at both levels. And so further analyzing this space, typologies are created based on their infrastructure and ground level characteristics called immediate, layered, and in-between spatial levels. And so within the last section, the spatial composition is linear in character and supplies a low ceiling to these outdoor rooms. And so most importantly, this space creates an enclosed volume similar in character to an indoor room with similar qualities to that of having walls, floors, and ceilings. Lastly, the overall topography of the above level is flat and consistent, which in character is completely opposite of the other sectional quality. And so finally, the proposed design focuses towards the most important spaces of the site with the linear spatial composition running under I-70 as a gathering and event-like space. Then within the in-between area of the site where the topologies are inconsistent above ground, others dynamic space that include an amphitheater, outdoor plaza, and an overall flexible space that can be used for many different functions. The overall space acts as a green infrastructure development, attempting to solve issues with the slope and potential rainwater runoff. By doing this, the potential for the space could act as a cooling zone within the summer months. And so overall, the ability to reconnect the spaces along the river, Cobb Point, and further into Strawberry Hill serves as a primary ambition for the studio group. And so within a series of raised trails, outdoor plaza space, and multiple space functioning as event gathering and community involvement areas, the space gives the community outdoor public room, continuing up to St. John's Park and beginning to make connections with nearby spaces. And so this overall composition of the space attempts to work with the slope, providing community space that brings them down the slope through a designed public realm. And so overall, this is kind of the composition of how we are attempting to connect to Cobb Point, to Strawberry Hill, and then over and across the river to the green spaces alike. And so this is a precedent study of InfraSpace 1. This is in similar characteristic to what we're trying to achieve with running infrastructure above ground. And then following that, how we can string local trails throughout this space and kind of treat this as a continuous public realm. And then lastly, their overall plan showcases the unique character of the space. And so within this northern section, which is towards the Central Industrial District, the focus is within that river stretch area. And so some of the biggest issues we are dealing with is the CID area, which has an extremely large brownfield on the east side, levee flood walls as a physical barrier, and then on the west side of the vast area of rails, highway, and steep topography. And so within the site photo sequence, the first image provides a glimpse of the levee system. And then the second photo reveals the current state of the river. And next, an abandoned bridge is within view of the CID site. And then lastly, the east side of the riverbank is revealed in its current state. And so moving to the concept diagrams, conceptually, this shows the loops that could be created of pedestrian travel. And so a major issue to this proposed pedestrian access is the current existence of an immediate brownfield to the east. And so to do this, we looked at a reference of a past year's project for a 5 to 20-year plan of remediation, then how development could proceed on top of those zones once remediation is complete. And so this plan shows the previous studio's development of the remediation and then how that could look like. Then the potential development, increasing density to multifamily housing and commercial strips. So this is definitely something we will take from and expand in our future design strategies. And so moving to the west side development, another context area that was important for us to start developing was the underside of the Central Avenue Viaduct. As seen in the pictures, it is what we call a concrete graveyard, abandoned and leftover industrial use. This site starts to have potential for access to the river, and it can help complement the river loop we are trying to develop. There is an opportunity in this space to have a significant public building of some sort of recreational/event land use. And so when exploring how these buildings might want to be shaped, we looked back and how our analysis of viewshed as you are driving through. One important feature that stood out are these billboards. They tower over everything and start to relate to the traffic level. The massing of this building would then act like a billboard and towering over the Central Avenue Bridge on top. Then on the bottom, it seeks to relate to the public scale. And so finally, these sections showcase the proposed development on both sides of the river, how the billboard-like building form will interact with the space around it. And then moving to the Strawberry Hill River connection, another important aspect we looked at was how we could connect Strawberry Hill to the river. Most importantly, how this closes the river loop and completes the pedestrian experience along the river. And so we looked at the space between Strawberry Hill and the bridge and section to understand the area. This one shows a picture of the highways and rail that separate the under Central Ave area from Strawberry Hill. And so this one shows the aspect from the under Central Avenue area. So the idea for this connection is a pedestrian bridge walkway that takes you over the rail and infrastructure to the landing point on Strawberry Hill. And the landing point by the abandoned bridge would be infilled to match the levee height for access straight down to the river off this landing. The pedestrian bridge has stopping points, built up landings in between where the rail and highways would allow it. And so overall, this is the master plan. Combining all these ideas, we start to develop what this area starts to look like. Increased density on the east side and a unique land use on the west that both communities on each side of the river could begin to utilize. And so looking at certain precedent studies, Domino Park proves to be a viable solution and an ambition for this area of the river stretch. And that is all for the I-70 to Central Industrial District Group.
We would like to open this now to a brief comment and discussion. I just want to reiterate once again, these are preliminary thinking or ideas about the possibilities here, issues that we are thinking we need to address in order to start developing this kind of public realm of the river and create this major public thoroughfare that can connect Cobb Point and Armourdale. There are obviously, these are just preliminary stages. So this is going to be further discussed with the community throughout the next semester. But at this preliminary level, we would also appreciate if you have any comments and thoughts about what we present to you.
We just had a question from Kim. In the development of the connection over rails, were you able to get input from the rail companies? If so, what were their thoughts? Any of our students have an answer for Kim?
I don't believe that there's been any dialogue with the rail companies. I know our understanding is that they're very difficult to deal with. And but one thing we've learned through precedent studies and some of the other kind of examples that we've learned is that there's an opportunity to go over the top, or an opportunity to go even tunneling under, that there's an ability to connect. But of course, it would be of our interest to have dialogue with those companies so that we can understand their kind of their behavior and what their thoughts would be about it, and if there was a potential to even work with those companies. But I definitely know that through some of our dialogue with some people around the city, that they're not the easiest to deal with.
Again, maybe I can suggest, obviously, as we continue to work with you, and I failed to mention at the beginning of the presentation that we have an advisory group that works with us. They include these representatives from the city and some other interest groups, as well as people who have expertise in let's say, levies and some of those other infrastructural aspects. And certainly our intention is to, once when these ideas become more present in the project, we want to have dialogue with them and explore the possibilities. At this point, obviously the intention is not to kind of utilize, to the extent possible, rail land, especially not for any kind of human habitation, but just see if we can get air rights that would allow us to bring the bridge across. And in that, we also look at the optimal place where that bridge might be established. So this is not by any stretch of imagination fixed and determined.
We also have a question from Suzanne. Seems like these public spaces might be vacant a lot and not feel safe, or might be difficult to maintain. Any research about increasing density locally or bringing people to this area via public transportation to a landmark, quote unquote, attraction of some sort?
I would say, just speaking from that infrastructure space, one thing that does remain difficult, like currently, is that there is a homeless population kind of community that meanders through. So that's obviously some of the main points. And even throughout the site, not just this area, we have issues of kind of that vacancy that promotes a lot of that kind of communities around. And so what I would say is, going through our development of design, that is definitely something we need to look at, and we'll continue to look at, is how do we make this much more public, to where it is harder for those type of things to happen. I know as we develop on the east side of the river with higher density, that is one of the hopes, is to cleanse that area as well, because west side of James Street is also very blighted. And so increasing density there of some sort, and building off of what a previous studio did, should help at that location. And then west of the river towards, which is that land bank area that we hadn't really mentioned, but in that purple to the west, that is a land bank area that's currently abandoned at the moment, with previous businesses that are left to rot. So being able to kind of build those areas to higher density, and an opportunity to include pedestrian access from Strawberry Hill, is the hope that kind of at a foundation should help building an attraction. And then I know with the building on that west side of the river, our hopes is to create kind of a landmark attraction. So that is definitely kind of in the same thought process of what you're recommending.
So this question I think will be easier for me to ask live rather than through chat. You guys presented a few different ideas here. Of these ideas, if you had to choose one or two to start implementation of first as sort of a catalyst to get the rest of the idea going and to create support and energy from the community, which idea do you think would be the best to start with as that catalyst project?
I think that's a really good question, and kind of speaking to it a little bit from the river stretch point of view, I think that kind of head node up at I-70 and Caw Point would be a really good place to start implementation, because it's not involving a ton of building and development right off, and it's also dealing with kind of set point at the end of the river already with Caw Point and strengthening that. So I think, yeah, trying to first factor in some of these green infrastructure spaces and public realm opportunities that are easier and maybe a shorter time frame than some of these increased density long-term developments might be the goal. And I think secondly, maybe some of those larger maybe some of that like directly adjacent property on James Street or like at the entrance to Strawberry Hill might be some of those first spots for development opportunities.
Yeah, and to follow you up, Ken, one thing to note too is that the northern section of I-70 is certainly more of a short-term, I would call it more of a short-term ambition, only because the development doesn't have the issues of the brownfields that the section to the south has. So for that area to the west of the river, for that to really be developed and to be at its full potential, the east side of the river development of multifamily will need to happen so there would be two communities kind of being able to share that space. And so we're looking from that previous studio, we're looking at about a 5 to 20 year remediation. And then on top of that, then development would start to happening after that. So that would be more of a long-term goal. So I would agree with Kent that if we had to do like a base ranking system, that the area towards the north at I-70 and how we connect to Caw Point would be super beneficial in the short term.
So if there are no other comments, or maybe in the interest of time, I don't want to cut anybody short, that we can move to see the second design section of the project, where we are trying to focus on the design investigations. So.
Yep, I think that works. So I've already spoken a bit, but I will go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Michaela Lindeman. I'm a fifth-year architecture student from Kansas State University. I'm going to walk us through the next sections of the site where we began developing conceptual designs and overarching strategies, which is within the Armourdale neighborhood at the intersections of the river and Kansas Avenue and 7th Street. And there are some key concerns that we want to reiterate that we shared earlier. They are the crime statistics, health conditions, activity centers, and bus routes. There are known gangs in the Armourdale area and the possibility of more forming. The community does not feel safe. And so physical activity and social engagement are also important to incorporate, as obesity and mental health are concerns that affect a majority of the population. And then lastly, there are a few locations of activity centers in Armourdale, and the bus lines don't reach all the zones of this neighborhood. And so beginning with the basic conceptual zones at just the node level, we foresee increased density within each of the two areas, as well as public realm opportunities that interact with the river. Each node interacts with surrounding linkages and creates a relationship with existing conditions and seeks to benefit the community and connect them with the river. And looking a bit deeper into the intentions of the space, Kansas Avenue and 7th Street are proposed as green streets with greater density that promote walkability, address green infrastructure needs, and move users to the intended destination areas along the riverfront. The triangle created by these two corridors and the Kansas River confine this industrial district so as not to encroach on new development and residential areas. And we see areas of the community engaging with and benefiting from this new design, especially by serving the Armourdale residential area and creating a connection to Hy-Vee Arena and the planned stockyards developments. And finally, we identified issues in the Armourdale neighborhood and relevant surroundings that influence design strategies and phasing, such as the active brownfield north of Kansas Avenue, the flood hazard at the intersection of Kansas Avenue and 7th Street, the lack of access to the riverfront from 7th Street, and the outfalls, which are currently very prominent in the site. So we begin looking at the conditions of and the design strategies for the Kansas Avenue node. The land along Kansas Avenue near the river is primarily used for commercial and industrial purposes with no current area for public use or recreation. And zooming into our focused area, the parcel highlighted in red is currently owned by a dog treat factory called KC Treats, and it's an active brownfield with multiple contaminants in the soil. This area is composed of mostly vacant land with a few oversized and underutilized parking lots situated around the warehouse buildings. In this east to west section showing the current site conditions, you can clearly see the amount of vacant land that's present in the area. On the western bank, on the right side of the section, the river is almost entirely ignored and underutilized. And in this north to south section along the western bank of the river, 2 industrial warehouses occupy prime real estate with a large and mostly unused parking lot in between them. And this diagram shows the large amount of both recent and proposed development in the area along the river. The recently renovated Hy-Vee Arena functions as an indoor youth sports facility with an 8,500 person capacity. The Yards, which is along a large apartment complex designed by Kim Studio, opened just this year with plans to build a second set of apartment buildings called the Yards 2 near the riverfront. The area highlighted in yellow, excuse me, is part of the Riverfront Master Plan with a proposed set of mixed-use buildings and riverfront revitalization. The Rock Island Bridge, highlighted in orange, will soon be developed into a major pedestrian space with recreational functions like seating, public restrooms, and a bar. The areas highlighted in green are the spaces in which our studio proposes adding public space, connections to the river, and forest preservation that will help improve some of the environmental issues in the area and complement the many new development projects. And this is the overall master plan of the area along Kansas Avenue with proposed public spaces, mixed use development, and greenery. And first we'll look at the riverfront area near the Rock Island Bridge. In this area, we're proposing a large section of terraced public plazas that bring people right up to the water's edge and connect to the levee trail, along with a new parking lot near the KC Treats building. In the top right, you can see the proposed outdoor floating stage on the river and the terrace stairs and ramp or stramp that is part of the riverfront master plan. And here's another view of what the terraced riverfront might look like. The indentations in the left part of the terrace are boat slips for people to park their boats, and the local rowing club could also use this area to launch their boats as well. And next, we'll look at our brownfield remediation or cleanup plan for the KC Treats parcel. In phase 1 of our plan, we examine the current conditions of the area. The ground on this site is contaminated with multiple heavy metals and VOCs, which need to be removed from the soil. And in phase 2, we suggest a few different ways to extract the contaminants over a 15-year time frame. One of those extraction methods is called phytoremediation, or planting certain species of plants and trees that can remove and contain the contaminants. We also mentioned a few other methods, including the use of chemicals to extract the contaminants, removing the topsoil, and extracting the VOCs via drilling. These are just a few suggested ways to clean up the site, and ultimately a lot of testing will need to be done in order to figure out which methods would work best for the area. And lastly, we suggest the site to grow naturally and become a forested area over the span of several decades. Having a lot of trees on the site will help to improve many of the current issues in the area, such as heat island effect, noise pollution, bad smells, air pollution, and etc. Next, we'll look at some sections through our proposed urban plaza and the riverfront terraces. So these 2 next slides show the different ways in which people can cross over the levee and down to the river. And then this section shows the scale of the urban plazas that we're proposing between those 2 warehouse buildings. And this rendering shows the brownfield and the proposed phytoremediation plan with new trees and vegetation. And then this next rendering shows the boat slips and the terrace seatings by the Rock Island Bridge. And next we'll focus on Kansas Avenue and our proposals for improving the public realm along this road. This aerial photograph shows the amount of underutilized space right under the street. Most parcels either have large parking lots or lawn space that contribute to the lack of street definition in this area. And then here are some sections and photographs showing the current conditions of Kansas Avenue and the lack of buildings along the street. And then this is our plan for the new development along Kansas Avenue, with the purple buildings being our proposed infill buildings. And this axon shows how our proposed park space that can be an asset for local residents. And then next, we'll show some sections of that park and some of the green infrastructure that we're proposing along the street to provide shade. And then we're also proposing to add bioswales and rain gardens to help contain and clean rainwater and then dissipate it into the ground instead of into the sewer system. And lastly, this next rendering shows what our green infrastructure along Kansas Avenue will look like. And then next we're going to move into the 7th Street node. So at the south end of 7th Street lies the largest green space within our site. It contains over 70 acres of undeveloped land, including 15 acres of dense tree canopy. Western views look out over the river bend and eastern views show downtown KCMO. We recommend that this land becomes a community green space and residential area. The creation of a park and residential area would protect the area from the encroaching industrial zone, establish a connection to the riverfront for the community of Armourdale, and provide greater tax revenue for the city. Flooding and heat and pollutants from the nearby industry can be improved by the thoughtful use of the land and the expansion of green infrastructure to 7th Street. And further looking into social opportunities and needs in the site, there are bus routes and bike paths that already run past the site and a new levee trail for pedestrians and cyclists that's planned for the area. A nearby park, community center, and hall host community events. The new park could provide an additional larger gathering space for the community. And there are relatively few landowners, and one of these is Kansas City, Kansas. And looking at the existing conditions of Armourdale, industry has been the most notable presence. Pedestrian walkways and public spaces do exist, but they are overpowered by car traffic. And looking more specifically around the 7th Street Bridge, forested areas as well as unused open green space dominate the river's edge underneath and around the bridge. The two lines are present between where the 7th Street Bridge starts and the top of the levee. So going back to our area's concept, we see the Riverfront Park as a major hub for the overall KCDC river plan and a starting point for the river trail. The two destinations of the Kansas Avenue node and the 7th Street Park node create an axis at the Kansas Avenue and 7th Street intersection. And we recommend developing this intersection into a arrival point for the neighborhood and developing 7th Street into a mixed use and pedestrian corridor similar to our plans that we have for Kansas Avenue. And so we started the process of evaluating the best use of infill and form-based code and determining a pedestrian access point for the park via the 7th Street Viaduct. A main priority for this park is the tree preservation at the north end of the site that will assist in maintaining the naturality of the site, as well as reduce noise and air pollution coming from the industrial buildings beyond. The site is then further divided into two primary functions, which are the housing complexes on the west end and recreation on the east. So the western side of the site was proposed for residential because of its access to 12th Street and the levee wall that will run through the middle of this area. To work with the levee wall rather than against it, housing can rise above the wall while parking remains tucked behind the wall. To encourage a river-oriented presence along the shoreline, terracing extends outward from the wall down to the river edge and is met by a boardwalk that moves above the water's surface. Toward the center of the site, the shoreline is developed outward to push the outfall away from the pedestrian trails and can allow for remediation of the current eroded landscape. The eastern side begins to take shape as a recreational zone and public amenity. Sports fields, a rec center, and a kayak rental shop encourage physical fitness and community interaction, as well as create a destination point that engages the river. And these two sections begin to address the differing conditions of the two functions, as well as allude to homogeneity with the interplay of terraces for seating in the bottom section and the terraces for sport courts in the upper section. But the overarching question was, how do we get to this park? There's an access road for the industrial buildings and several rail lines that need to be crossed. This is where we address the underside of the 7th Street Viaduct. This previously unused space becomes a key component to our design intentions. A pedestrian trail will ramp along the western side of the vehicle bridge, and rather than mimicking the path of the traffic, the pedestrian bridge, now elevated, will cross underneath the viaduct and move south between the viaduct structures until all the rail lines are crossed. Then a spiral ramp descends to the ground level and allows users to continue the path under the viaduct to engage with booths that are intended for weekly farmers markets, community festivals, and events similar to First Fridays here in Kansas City, Missouri. A little walk further south and users are met with a pier that stretches into the river and doubles as a boat dock for access to the park for users of the Kansas River. And this section details the intention for the pedestrian bridge and the ramp that will descend to the booths. The pedestrian bridge reaches its maximum height at the top of the spiral ramp, where a view to downtown KC will be a stark contrast to the previous trail that traveled under the viaduct and above the rail lines. Overall, this park is intended as an amenity for the community and the neighborhood of Armourdale to work with the industrial nature of the area rather than the segmentation that they currently experience. We intend to create opportunities for interaction with the river that the neighborhood does not currently have, to encourage users to recreate both on land and on water, and to provide a destination that combines infrastructure and nature. The 7th Street plan preserves a large, relatively untouched park space, creates a major riverfront connection and starting point for the riverfront trail, and creates a defined edge for the residential area. And then our key takeaways for this note are that the area is currently dominated by industrial buildings, but we seek to find a balance between this zoning, new mixed-use developments, and the naturality that it currently exists at the riverfront. The area is to serve as an amenity for Armourdale and connect them with the rest of the city. And finally, the riverfront strategies that we have proposed will become a destination that encourages social engagement and recreation. And I believe this will be our final Q&A that we would like to open up.
Great job, Michaela. You just kind of caught up us all kind of delayed in the presentation, so we have 10 minutes left for the discussion.
I'm pretty good at zooming through.
So I hope we still have audience present. So obviously we invite you to respond to this, but as well, feel free to think about the relationship between this and I-70 area. And hopefully, you know, we can just open it to more comprehensive discussion if you choose to do so. So we can have some kind of feedback and input and the takeaways that we can think further about the issues and choice of the areas that we are trying to look into and propose for catalytic development.
I just want to say I think this is a great start to setting up something great. The next interesting thing is obviously you guys have proposed and identified possible solutions or interventions that could benefit. Now I'm just interested on the social human aspect of it. How will people receive it? How will people really use it? What is their input? And from that derive something meaningful that could have a very powerful impact day one, especially to the early analysis you guys made that KCK is a very diverse cultural population, and not losing sight of that as you develop further solutions. Great job, and I'm very excited to see what you guys are doing.
Thank you.
And I just want to make sure that it's understood that we invite criticism too. So whatever it is that we are not getting or not understanding, or even if there are some thoughts and ideas here that appear to be contradictory, at least through your perspective, I want to invite you, feel free to express those, because we really want to develop a dialogue and really kind of be as comprehensive and outreaching in our design thinking. And Andres, I appreciate your point about the community engagement. That's going to be paramount part of our development in the next phase of the project, and absolutely having a chance to have community input and bearing on the project and finding the integrated vision between the community aspirations and opportunities of the site is certainly something we want to facilitate to the greatest possible degree.
Yeah, I just have one's more of just a comment on graphics, and another is just a comment on something that would be beneficial for you to look further into. The first one being that I'm a landscape architect, the representation of trees in a lot of these renderings, they're all the same, and you'll never find one tree that's the same size, same height, trunk size, everything like that. So adding kind of a differentiation in these trees will really help these renderings look more natural in a way. And then the other comment is that thinking about the yards phase 2 that's going in, that's going to draw a completely different group of people than the people that are living in this Armourdale neighborhood across the street. So really trying to understand how these two different communities are going to interact with each other is also something that could be beneficial further on in the study.
Great, thanks, Caleb. You know, this semester we don't have any landscape architecture students in our studio. So I want to invite you back to KCDC if you ever feel you want to come and share your wisdom. I would love to have you here.
Yeah, anytime you want. I'm just down the street.
Sounds great.
I had a comment also about the visualizations and some of the graphics. I think you guys have done a really good job. I'm very impressed with this result. It's a crazy difficult problem that you guys are working on. So I give you a lot of respect for this. I spent some time over there, and I live in Lawrence now. I'm an architectural and urban designer here. And I know that you've reached out to the community there, and I'm assuming you've talked to people, or you will talk to people there in the community. But one thing that might be beneficial to you when you're presenting something like this, especially with the community engagement and outreach, is to include more images of people and activities that already happen in the neighborhood. Like I think you mentioned that there's a car culture, like lowriders, I think is what you said, underneath one of the overpasses. And it'd be cool to integrate that into some of your visualizations for the future designs. Or like the Dia de Muertos parade is such a huge deal there. You know, just get more liveliness maybe in showing images of multi-generational families or signs in Spanish and things like that. I think will help you reach your intended audience when you present this, both in the city and then also in community meetings. But beyond that, yeah, I really do congratulate you. This is a ton of work, and I'm curious to see what you come up with in the next semester. Thanks.
That's a great point. Thank you for your feedback.
We also had a quick comment from Roger in our chat. He mentioned that North arrows would be a plus to help maintain orientation on the visuals, and also some of the color keys were difficult to read with some of the text. So we'll keep that in mind going forward with the maps.
And Susan, I really appreciate your comments, and maybe a question, if any of you still present can offer us, you know, and this is not to make an excuse, but unfortunately the COVID-19 situation is somewhat kind of compromising our engagement opportunities. One of them being that our public meeting today is online as opposed to being in person. I know Michaela and a few others in our group have tried and have actually met with the communities, had exchanges with the communities, but also obviously as this project carries to next semester, that's going to be a challenge just because physical interaction is becoming more and more limited. So if any of you guys have any thoughts and ideas how we can further enhance that, that would be greatly appreciated. Andres, I have a question for you. Do you have any connections to the Armourdale community, and would you have anybody to recommend that we can connect with and seek out and it doesn't have to be only Armourdale community, but anybody that you may be connected to and aware of that can be a good source of community engagement and information that could help us out? Well, I don't know if there are any other comments. If there are not, I would like to thank all of you, especially those of you who provided us comments and input. And I also want to invite you to continue to check our website and our social media. We will try to use as much as possible our social media to provide feedback and input in the project. And I would much appreciate a chance to hear back from you, engage with us. And also, we would be happy to really create an opportunity to kind of meet on Zoom anytime any of you feels like would like to engage with us. This is also an invitation to build a relationship and connect through the remainder of the project. So thank you all for being here. And I thank my students for doing a great presentation. So,
Hey, Vlad.
yes.
Just one additional thing that on your last comment, as far as like how to engage the community a little more. I know in this area there's a lot of local restaurants that are kind of family owned in a way, taquerias and stuff like that. So really just going into those, I feel like, and even if it's talking to the people that are working there for 5 minutes or so, and just kind of understanding certain things about the neighborhood, why they live there, or what they like about it, what's important to them. I think that could be very beneficial, just because there are a lot of very small localized restaurants in that area.
Great. Yep. Thanks, Caleb. That's great. Okay. Well, with that, I think we can close our presentation. Thank you very much, everybody, once again. And we look forward to sharing our work with you in the future and getting your feedback and input. So thank you very much.